All
right.
So yeah, it's DBQ for period 5. Time period 5 is pretty much that mid 19th century. Period 4 and 5 are both like from 1800 to 1870, basically. So it's really that the first American democracy, because before 1800 we're not really like, we're still in the beta testing, right? Like we're not really developed yet. We're figuring things out. And then with Jefferson's presidency, we really hit the ground running. So our main question here is very broad, which usually the DBQs are pretty broad and period based. And so this one is to analyze the political issues and debates in the period between the writing of the Constitution and 1860 that led to the Civil War. So these are going to be, well, what do you think of when you read this prompt, I guess?
I mean, yeah, it's like we've got like, I mean, the things that are like closer to Civil War, to 1860, like we obviously have things like the, I don't know, the Fugitive Slave Act. You have things like Supreme Court decisions like Dred Scott. You have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is like obviously a huge like shifting of it's the juggling of the powers that makes things problematic, right? And so it's like when those things started to get disturbed and every like little, you know, keystroke from there on, those things like escalate the tension between the two.
Sure. And so I guess mechanically speaking, from the English side of it or the writing side of it, I guess a little bit of both, what would you say is the way to attack this prompt and understanding it? So, you know, when we see analyze, it becomes for me, I'm like, well, I can analyze it. But, you know, students, I always get asked like, well, what do you mean to analyze this?
Right. So like my brain, when I'm told to analyze it, I'm going to like introduce some background information on the thing that pings my mind. So if I need to talk about Kansas-Nebraska Act, I need to say what it is. And then from there, talk about the effect, because the thing right here is like, it's essentially like what is leading up to like a moment. The Civil War is the culmination of a moment of like high political discord and unrest, right? So like unpacking then would be introduction of the idea. So like my main idea, like one event that, or one political issue, I'm just going to keep using this because I'm doing my tongue, but like, you know, one escalating issue in terms of, you know, political tension between the periods of the Constitution and the Civil War is as the, you know, signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and then explaining what it is and then going in and saying like, here's the consequences of that action in particular. By doing that, the escalation of tension was this is the effect of that policy.
So we're really looking at causation then, like, because we know the effect is the Civil War.
Right.
So, and I think that's I think when we see analyze in history, many times it is a causation style prompt. So I appreciate that side of it. And really from the historical side, looking at the Constitution, there are historians now that call the Constitution a pro-slavery document. And so when we, and also it establishes our, you know, the functional democracy that we live in today. So, you know, that's really marking that beginning of American democracy, because the colonial period doesn't matter in this prompt, right? So we have to set the boundary. And so right off the bat, you have to know that the writing of the Constitution, 1787 to 1790 is that writing and ratification period, the constitutional conventions. And then 1860, obviously, basically the eve of the Civil War. I would say for where my brain goes is the political issues would be one group, because that would be more of like, how are politicians of the time manipulating the arguments?
Okay.
Whereas debates is really that more civil rights, human rights, morality debate.
Sure.
It might not have as much political motive, I guess. Whereas the political issues they're gonna be skewed. They're not gonna be the same as like, it's kind of like if you talk to somebody off the record versus on the record.
Right.
And and debates would be much more social as well, like more society.
So then we're thinking like Lincoln Douglas debates. Like if you had to put if you had to put like so that's my question for these ones. Then as the writer, as the student writing this, what is then my task? Like what's the optimum way to write this? Do I write it in a way that like, hey, here's one of the political issues and then I unpack it? Or do I look at like, okay, what is the like, do I have to define, like, that's a 70-year period with a lot of massive issues. Are we like, you know, more or less isolationist when we look at the like emergence of like revolution in France, right? And like
right, exactly,
signing of the ratification of the Constitution. So like what is, as the AP grader potentially, like what are they looking for?
So there's a handful of things in the rubric, and really it's just trying to meet what you can, like basically, you know, like if there's something in here, the first thing that you have to have is a historically defensible claim.
Right.
So it's not enough to make a thesis that it has to be backable by historical evidence. You can't have something that you just come up with and go, sounds right, sounds good. Sure. But it has to be supported by the historical record. You know, that's basically saying it can't be illogical. Right. There's always context is another point. So like you said, for analyzing it, building up to that, providing the causation of this for this event, you're creating context.
Right.
Right. And so that's context is very simple in terms of what the AP graders are looking for. It can be one sentence of background information related to the prompt. It is not a complex point to earn. And frankly, none of the points are that complex. It's just a matter of execution. And the complexity, I mean, I've talked to a couple AP graders about this, and they said that you don't even need paragraphs to score well.
Oh, what?
Which is exactly right. As a writing, because this is where the disconnect comes from. If you analyze 3 documents proficiently, and you can say like this is related to the prompt because the author had this point of view, and you know, provide your claim or your evidence for your claim, and you do that for 3 documents, that's a point. You can just bullet point them. Because at the end of the day, the DBQ is a rough draft, and a historical rough draft is gonna be a lot of just claim evidence reasoning without any of the functional mechanical, like what I call fluff.
So then are you then, like, as the writer, as the student, I am here trying to jam and contextualize as many political issues and debates as possible during that? Like, just am I issue spotting, or am I trying to pick like like overarching? I have a document. Okay, that's what it is.
Yeah, we have documents.
Okay. I was like, wait a minute. I could literally just go off the top like for hours.
No. So basically, what we were doing was creating context. Right. And this is what I suggest for students to do. It's break down the prompt, understand what they're asking, find your context. And if your context is not related to the documents in terms of like direct content, that is another point, because if you bring that in, that's your outside information point.
Right.
So there's a handful of points here that you can really, really get with minimal writing structure, if that makes sense. So the first document, and they do, and from my experience, they do a pretty good job of setting the documents up chronologically. So if you have trouble figuring out the chronology of the question, look at document 1, that'll most likely be the earliest, and document 7 will be the last part of that. And so at the very least, you can provide your reader with a comparison and contrast by saying, look at document 1 and what it showed at the beginning of this time period, and look at document 7 and what it showed at the end of this time period. And you can really use that as a way to show, like, I have historical skills, here they are, right? Causation, comparison, those are historical skills that they look for. The first one is just the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. I'm not going to read it, but essentially this is the one where it says that any non-white person is considered 3/5 of a person, and including those bound to service for a term of years, which slavery, right? And so this is where for me, at least, the Constitution is pro-slavery. I mean, it doesn't explicitly say you can't do it. And they're like, oh, bound to service for a term of years, which is also known as slavery.
Slavery, right. Well, and then like we've talked about this a bunch of times, right? Like you can, so then if you can unpack like what the, so as the writer, if I can unpack like the significance of this with the Civil War as the end date in mind, and like talk about like shifting of, you know, state power in the Union at this point, right? We've talked about this endlessly. Like Jefferson doesn't get elected if this doesn't happen, right?
Absolutely.
So if I'm the writer, I'm like trying to like just, wow, I'm gonna launch into that. I'm gonna unpack like how that shifts a trend that then impacts and leads up to the Civil War. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yep. And this is really one of those things where, you know, people overlook representation in terms of political representation because it's something that we just take for granted, or we used to. I mean, recently we've kind of reevaluated that, but people look at that and go, well, the Electoral College is just that. They have that many people. That's it. And you know, like you said, Jefferson doesn't get elected without this clause. So already we understand that this is going to decide presidential elections. This is going to decide the balance of power, because it's saying that these states with 500,000 slaves now get to add in another, I don't know, what's 3/5 of that, 200 something thousand, you know, votes that they don't have to account for. Like they don't have to win a vote for that. They just get extra votes. It's almost like a super delegate, if you will.
Right.
So that to me would mark both of those boxes, political issues and debates, because it's going to be debated, especially when you think about not every state has the same population. Therefore, representation varies. And now we have political debates as well.
Right.
So that one to me could go either way, I guess, if we're doing grouping. It kind of just depends on the rest of the documents. And that's what I always tell the students too. If you're not sure and it could go in both boxes, leave it unchecked and just kind of manipulate where you need to move it.
How many do I like need to use? 3, 5?
So there's various points of the rubric ask for different amounts. So I'm
a gunner. I want to get as high a score as possible.
Then you need 6.
6. Okay.
So there's one document you can throw out.
Oh, okay.
Right. And that's where it's like, if it checks both boxes and you're not sure on it, that might be the one to throw out.
Right.
So there's that. The Missouri Compromise, again, talking about representation, talking about why it matters what states do and do not allow slavery. This is not the Constitution, right? This is not necessarily, this isn't an amendment. This is just a piece of legislature that gets passed.
Right.
Which is interesting because obviously it's important enough for the government to discuss, but there's got to be an ulterior motive there, right? For the government to not address this as an amendment.
Right. There has to be some hesitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, 1820, so we're 15, 17 years after the Louisiana Purchase, which again, you know, if you had some deep background outside information on Louisiana, talking about the Louisiana Purchase, talking about how the only reason we were able to gain the Louisiana Territory in the first place through purchase was because Napoleon was bleeding money in Europe.
Right.
And he stretched himself too thin.
Sure.
So at his, you know, basically him overstretching his empire allows us to expand, right? Like his overexpansion allows us to get into expansion, just because he can't afford it and he's losing money and it just doesn't make sense.
So then how do you group this one then?
So this one I would say would be part of the political issues. At this point, what it's looking like, and just going off the first two documents, is that grouping is going to be very difficult for this one.
Right, that's what my thought was.
Yeah, because if you're talking about political issues and debates, I mean, both of these so far have gone through that, which is where the comparison and the causation skills can also give you that complexity. So the last point that we have on our rubric is really looking for a very detailed and in-depth, complex understanding of the topic. And so by showing those things like causation, by showing those things like compare and contrast, and by actually writing out the essay, not by bullet pointing, right? Then you're going to score that complexity point. Just because you're showing a very strong command of the content. So I would say that this document 1 and 2, those two could be compared because they are various, they do have varying degrees of legality to them. Mm-hmm. The Constitution is obviously a lot more strict as opposed to the Missouri Compromise, but at the same time, nobody's really going to, the Missouri Compromise doesn't allow you to bring a state into the Union that's, in the North, it's a slave state. So there's a certain amount of legally binding content in this, but it's not to the degree of document 1.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I agree.
And they both dance around the term slavery for the most part.
Involuntary servitude, uses like euphemisms.
Yeah, this is the 18th century dog whistle, right? 18th, 19th century dog whistles. They say slavery in this one here in section 8, but it's not like out in front,
Well, they de-escalated immediately. It's not just slavery, it's involuntary servitude. It's not the same thing.
Right. Exactly. And so really what we see moving forward through this time period is there's a pretty big gap. I mean, between 1820 and 1846, that's a pretty sizable gap there. So you would have to, in terms of the debates part of the prompt, you would almost have to bring up like the debates continued on through this time period over whether or not certain states should or should not be considered slave or free states. And the Wilmot Proviso, which is in 1846, tries to extend that and clarify the debate, because this is when we're talking about land that we will gain from Mexico.
Right.
And so Missouri Compromise, great, we got that settled, and now we're like, oh, also we're expanding. So now what? Because you're getting into states like California that are both north and south.
Right. So this one, I think this one talks really well with the previous document then.
Yes, definitely. And so I think that's where document 1 establishes the ground rules, right? Mm-hmm. And then documents 2 and 3 so far, like you said, they're very closely related. They kind of echo the same sentiments at least, but just various time periods. Well, and so also,
you also need like less, like they're passed with less like checks, right? Like a constitutional amendment is like super checked. These are less checked. Okay. Absolutely,
very much so. And it takes the process to get that passed, with the amount of states to adopt an amendment, not an easy process. Look at the Equal Rights Amendment that we haven't been able to pass yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Oh, my guy. This is my guy, John Brown. This is where the outside information and context comes in. right? Because if you just see, or this is your document you throw out, depending on how much you retain going into this. If you get a source like this and says John Brown, and you're like, who? Move on. You know.
And then you're kind of scared too, because you might also have you're looking at the subtext, leader of the Harper's Ferry insurrection. If you don't know it's like a abolitionist insurrection, then you're kind of it's a lost source.
Right, absolutely. And I think this is where it becomes important to understand that people like John Brown, abolitionists, are the ones who are causing the debates to continue.
Right.
Those are the people that are forcing the needle to move. Otherwise, the government could just look at it and be like, did you not see what we passed 10 years ago? Like we already did this, man.
We've been here.
Been there, done that. Don't need to rehash it. And so people like John Brown and other abolitionists are the ones, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, all of them are going to be pushing that debate. And so for John Brown, I would look at it and say, it brings up a societal debate of whether or not his actions are warranted.
Right.
How do we handle some abolitionist vigilante? And is that acceptable? And I mean, the U.S. government says no, and they hang them for treason. But
right.
You know, but that's where he fits into that narrative in terms of this prompt.
Right, for sure. Okay. So that's the task then. It's like you have to make from the sources make some sort of that's the same thing that's true for the synthesis question on mine. So that's good to know.
Yes, absolutely. And really, you know, looking at document 5, this is a very obscure document to me. I would have never, I honestly, off the top of my head, I don't even know this document.
Because your brain goes Elizabeth Cady Stanton for Declaration of Sentiments, but it's Anti-Slavery Society Declaration of Sentiments.
Right. And William Dorr doesn't ring any bells. So with that, I would just be like, well, you know, they're talking about an anti-slavery society. So you have to imagine this would be an abolitionist sentiment.
Right.
Right. Talking about 57 years have elapsed since the Patriots convened in this place. So they're in Philadelphia at Independence Hall and basically where the Constitution was drafted. And they kind of throw a little dig at Jefferson, right? It's, you know, they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so they really are kind of calling out the hypocrisy there, which is that debate portion as well. Because this is not a political statement in terms of like a politician saying it. This would be a societal, Yeah,
I was looking at, so I was rereading it.
No, it's okay. It's like, dang, did I throw out the wrong name or something?
I'm like, oh shit.
And then here's a link into Joshua Speed. You know, it's a Lincoln letter, so you know where Lincoln stands on slavery.
Right.
And really, this would be even talking about Lincoln's views shift over time, as many politicians do. They're not the same the first day they take office and the last day that they take office.
Well, this is what, 2 years after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? Is that true?
1 year.
1 year.
1854.
Right. So you have Senate at this point, failed Senate bid, or almost no. He hasn't failed his Senate bid yet, right?
The Lincoln Douglas debates are a little later, 58, I think.
But he's nobody at this point, so that's important in context.
Absolutely.
Right. He's a lawyer, and that's it. And so if you don't have that time frame, then you could go substantially astray right here, right? And because it doesn't sound like it sounds like he is oppositional to slavery, but that he is not like, he's not forcing it upon the, right, there it is. Right, in my humble sphere, I shall advocate the restoration of the misery so long as it remains. So like he's not staunchly opposed. Like, I don't know.
But he's also not, yeah, he's just very like, I'm not against
Not
slavery.
for me. He says it's not for me.
Yeah, right.
I don't
It's
want
like,
people around me doing
okay.
it, but if it exists, it exists, and that's a fact in the world.
Yeah, and so he also kind of, it's an interesting dynamic here if you really think about the sentiment, right, of it. It's, he's saying basically that as long as it remains a territory, then it can have slavery. But if it's a state, no.
Right.
And so that's where you're like, well, what do you mean here? Why are you picking that distinction? And so this is the real minutia of the argument, right?
Right.
Is why would you care that once it becomes a state, it's a slave state, but if it's a territory, it doesn't? And this is where it would tie back to document 1.
Yeah.
Because this would be still, you have the 3/5 compromise. And so you really are looking at an idea of tipping the balance, tipping the scales for electoral power.
Right.
And that's really what it is, right? If you can manipulate the electorate to benefit you and your platform, then most politicians do it. And he also says, I do not admit that in taking a Negro to Kansas to be held in slavery is a possibility with any man. So he's like, also, I don't believe slavery is like morally acceptable.
Right.
And so he's like, politically, this is my view. You know,
that's
socially
worse. That's like worse. To me, that's worse.
Absolutely, because it's like, where's the strength in your convictions?
That's more egregious,
but yeah. So I think that's interesting as well. And he also says, any man who has sense enough to be the controller of his own property has too much sense to misunderstand the outrageous character of this whole Nebraska business.
It's so like such a moral high ground. He's like, or he's attempting to come from such a place of moral high ground. Like, it's beneath me to, like, slavery is beneath me. It should be beneath you as well, Joshua.
But if it's not, I'm just going to look differently at you. Like,
right.
Yeah, so that's an interesting argument there as well, especially when we look at the idea that Lincoln is he's the emancipator.
Right.
I mean, so I would tie this one to document 1.
Yeah, totally.
And then this is the one I told my students. I said, this is normally on the exam, and here we go.
This exact picture?
Yeah. This is the Free Soiler cartoon. It's kind of it's a very aggressive picture.
Right.
But it's 1856. So you're really at that last push up into the
so this is such
up into the Civil War.
This is an anti-democratic platform.
Yes.
This is like staunchly opposed to what is going to eventually be the dang. Okay. Shoot, that is aggressive.
Right. And the African American man in the picture here who's being forced into the throat of a free soiler, they call it. He's saying they're murder, right? He's claiming murder, and he's saying, help my, neighbors, help me. It's this idea that the Democrats, right, the Democratic platform is literally going to just completely consume and get rid of African American discussion of culture.
You don't even need to know what. I mean, you could kind of come to arrive at what free soiler means based on this, right? Like,
right, yeah.
I'm imagining.
It's opposing the extension of slavery.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing, and this is where the devil's in the details also, right? You know, because you have here Democratic platform. It's a reminder that if you couldn't remember that, you know, the Democratic Party at this time was the party of slavery, there's your reminder, right? Like, oh, light bulb, there we go. I got to rework that. And if there's any point where you write something that you don't agree with, or you go, oh man, I did not mean to write that, it's the simple strike through, and they don't take that into account for any, like, you can strike through everything, and they're not supposed to take that into account for your total score.
Oh, but so how does that work on the digital test? You just use the strike through function?
It could be like a Google Doc format where it saves previous versions, I guess.
It's not just like a delete and then like you can just like go back into the paragraph. It's probably not that easy, huh?
I would hope that it is.
Right.
But you never know.
No, you do not.
No, yeah, we found that out last year.
Right.
And I think that the important part of this this cartoon here, because it wraps up the time period we're looking at.
Right.
The important part is, if you don't abolish slavery, you are a slave nation.
Totally.
If slavery exists in one state,
you are that forever.
You are a nation of slavery. Yeah.
You're your worst.
It's like,
what is it? You are your worst day type of thing.
Kind of, yeah. Or like, you know, it only takes one student to act up to ruin it for everybody else. Right. And so this is where it's helping that societal debate of, look, where you can't do this. It's not functional anymore.
Dang. So then that's so many. Let's look at this. Wait, hold on. I'm interested in looking at this.
So yeah, I was just seeing what the So these are the scoring notes.
Oh, does it tell you what each of the documents does? Is that what they do?
Yeah, a little bit. So right here, let's see. It's gonna be this part right here.
Oh, yeah,
so
yeah.
A strong, yeah. So exactly, you're not gonna want to list characteristics. You're gonna need to make the connections. So if you're pointing out a characteristic of a document, you need to explain why that's important to the prompt and the context of the question. Basically.
Okay. So like it's exactly like you said, if you're making the slavery as a driving factor in the entirety potentially of that period and stuff, as long as you're connecting it back. This is what we like to do in our class, is a through line. Like your thesis through line needs to come through in each document. You always need to bounce back to it, right? So that's why they're saying, that's exactly what they're saying here. Okay.
Yeah, right there. It's that the primary factor in political debates was slavery. And this is where I always tell the kids every year, and I tell basically anybody that will talk to me about it, is that when we talk about the Civil War, and I said that, I think I even said this when we talked last, is that there is no other driving reason than slavery.
Right.
People who say that slavery wasn't the cause of the Civil War,
are wrong.
It was.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I respectfully disagree. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Adamantly. So the political cartoon and the Declaration of Sentiments support that part. So they're saying that 5 and 7 are related, which I could see. 5 was the one that talked about, let me just go back up. 5 was this one that I wasn't quite sold on in terms of my memory.
Right.
But it does talk about, there's no politicians involved necessarily. These are civilians essentially talking about this. So it's not necessarily driving that. It's not like the legislators are talking about it.
Right.
It's a societal debate. It's individuals talking about it and trying to influence the minds of voters. Which is the same as this one.
Right.
You're trying to convince people that slavery should not exist in our country.
Interesting. Good essay observes the document. Let's see. So they said 5 and 7 go together. The United States 1 says state street connection. 3 is compromise.
which would be Missouri Compromise there,
Right.
and Wilmot and Lincoln. So that's those would be, I guess, your groups, right? You got 4, 5, 7. So John Brown, Declaration of Sentiments, and the political cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
Those are much more social, what's happening with the everyday Americans, right? Mm-hmm. Not the legislators in Washington. And then what is it? 1, 2, 3, and 6. Those ones are much more legally binding. And even with Lincoln, he's referencing something that's legally binding. He's saying that I am not okay with it being a slave, with them allowing slavery if it's a state, but if it's a territory, do what you want.
Do they throw out document 4? They do.
They do, and that's kind of what I was saying there, where it's like, it's just a picture of John Brown. So if you want to rattle something off about John Brown, go for it.
But since it kind of detracts from the essay then, right? Because it's, unless you can.
Not necessarily.
So say I want number 4 and to combine number 4 with number 5, right?
Yeah.
Doc 4 and 5, because 5 is about the Anti-Slavery Society's Declaration of Sentiments, and 4 is a picture of John Brown, staunch abolitionist, who is anti-slavery to the extreme, right? The pronunciation of this to the extreme and the acknowledgement of this to the extreme on the level that is like willing to pay the ultimate price, which he does end up paying.
Yeah.
I can do that.
Absolutely. And I would say that the reason that would be beneficial in the great, as a reader, what it would do for me, it would say that you are able to identify the variance within the movement.
Right. Okay.
So you're showing a complex understanding of the abolition movement, understanding that a majority of people are writing things that are strongly worded and they're not happy about it, but they're not doing what John Brown did.
Right.
And so that's where there are a lot of people who believe that John Brown did what was right.
Right.
And I mean, he said it to his dying day. But a majority of people that wanted to have a little less of an abrasive approach didn't necessarily do that. So the abolitionist movement and the debates around abolition varied greatly in the degrees.
Right.
Yeah, and that's where the pictures are interesting, right? Sure. This is where this is what it says here. Outside knowledge might follow up on specific references such as Kansas-Nebraska Act or John Brown's raid. So it's almost like a free point if they give you a picture of somebody like that with nothing else. Mm-hmm. If they just say like, hey, talk about John Brown, they're like, I'll give you an outside point because there's nothing about John Brown in any documents other than his face.
And you're rewarded for knowing more.
If you bring in outside information or
and it's on the history, line. Yeah.
And it's on the through line, then you got a point.
There you go.
And 1 point on the DBQ is like 7 on the composite score.
Right. Dang, that's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. So that's where I always say that there's 4 very attainable points. It's a historically defensible claim. It's the context. It's the outside information. And then it would be understanding 3 documents that highlight and support your thesis.
So yeah, it's out of 6 in total, or
it's out of 7. There's I have the rubric I can show you here.
Oh, no worries. No.
It's out of 7, but the 7th point is like, do you show an in-depth complex understanding? It's like,
right. That's that unicorn point.
Right. Like nobody gets it. And so also, like you said with Dred Scott, that's another outside information point that they would award.
So do you think it's advantageous then at the beginning? Because like at the beginning we could you could write down kind of your gut reaction, and then do you do thesis generation, then go look at the documents and then fit the documents to support, or what do you do?
It's really on style, right?
Okay.
I think there's two different ways that I would approach it. The first way, which is kind of my way, I guess, would be to kind of what we did there. You read the question, I get the context in my head, I understand what the through line is, and so I already have 2 points. I have my context, and then I have my thesis, and that's my introductory paragraph, and I've checked those boxes before I even get bogged down in document analysis.
Because you don't want to lose them.
You don't want to lose it. You don't want to lose time. It's a safety net, right?
Sure.
At the very least, I know that I have written an introduction with 2 points in it.
Right.
And then I go through the documents and I try and find evidence that supports my claim, and it really amplifies what I'm trying to get across there, my point.
Sure.
Ideally, 2 groups would be great, and that would be, you would have that for each body point paragraph, right? The first one would have your first grouping, you would explain that. The second one would have your second grouping, and then whatever you have in there, you would throw in some outside information somewhere, wherever it's related. Like they're saying, if it's related to 6 or 7 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that's something like what you were saying at the beginning. If that's the front of my mind, let's do it. I'm going to talk about it.
Put it somewhere. Yeah, line it up.
Yeah. But if it's not, then maybe you're going to talk about John Brown.
Sure.
And if that's not, there's different ways you can plug it in there. The one thing that I have to caution everybody with is that your context point and your outside information may not be the same point.
Right. Okay.
So you have to have 2 separate pieces there, which is why I always say, save your outside information for the documents, put your context in your intro, and then move forward.
Right. Huh.
But that's pretty much the point there. And this is the sophistication point, right? If you're bringing up economic institutions, if you're bringing up the 13th Amendment, and it's very, very hard to get those points.
Right. Well, but then it's also hard because like they're sticking you in that period, right? And they're not. So if you're making comments about like the end of slavery on economic institutions, you're like, it's a little bit potentially beyond the frame of that period, right?
For sure. And really, this is where it would be a little beyond, but also not. I mean, there's the idea that a lot of our issues leading up to the Civil War had to do with protective tariffs, right, that protected the young industries in the North, but the agricultural industries in the South were far superior, or in terms of like technologically advanced,
right,
and could produce more than we could output, basically.
Right.
And so economically, we in the South, they sell their cotton to Britain because Britain is far more industrialized. Right. They have a need for our raw materials. And so by essentially cutting off this raw material pipeline with the use of slavery, you're taking the legs out from under the South financially.
Right.
And that's the argument there, is that you're the economic institution of Southern plantations is throughout this time period being challenged because of protective tariffs, protecting northern industries.
And you don't need to know that after that, the whole thing gets muddled.
Right.
You can talk about the process of the degrading of that system. Okay, that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's where, I mean, if you're bringing up economic institutions like that, and that, you are killing it.
Yeah, you're going to the moon, going Dogecoin.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey. Okay. Shoot.
So that's kind of the overview, I guess, with an example here. The other way to do it would be to just analyze all the documents first and then go from there.
Right. Well, it's very similar, I would say, to our synthesis question, in which you have to do something document based, but you have to have a central argument on a particular topic, and then you need to support it using the evidence of the pieces. So it's similar in that capacity, and it's the same kind of mechanism where you want to get as many points as possible. Thesis is part of it. Writing an introduction that sets you up. For us, it's only out of 6, but you can only get 1 in the intro, so it's a little bit like, blow for blow. It's probably about the same thing, but yeah.
How many documents are on yours though?
Could be up to 8. You'd use 5.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. So it's about the same.
I think maybe you have to use 4. They just changed it, but it's the same idea.
Yeah. Same idea. Yeah. It's just not as many. And that's where, if you analyze the documents incorrectly, you don't get the point.
Yeah.
And so that's where, I mean, if you know for a fact you analyze 3 documents correctly and you're short on time and you don't want to try and rush any more out, okay, you might have, scraped through that.
Right.
But if you have the time, go for 6, go for 7.
Right.
Because odds are you might have missed it.
You messed up point. Yeah. Dang.
Just, playing the odds there.
It's all games, man. It's all games. Shoot. Well,
Yeah.
I think kids are getting pretty close to playing this game for real next week, Wednesday.
Less than a week. Yeah.
Dang. Well,
6 days.
Well, hopefully this study's going well. Yeah, it's pretty good.
And then we're both available, or at least for whatever.
Don't speak for me.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
no,
sorry.
I
am.
Anyways, hopefully, if folks have made it this far, thank you. Welcome. Hopefully you enjoyed it. So like and subscribe, hit the bell button, and there'll be a t-shirt giveaway at 100 subscribers. So peace.
Yeah.